Distorted narratives, Russian propaganda and historical manipulation in education. Textbook edition. Hello everybody, this is True Crime Podcast from the Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group at Ukraine Crisis Media Center, where we take on Russian propaganda and discuss hybrid threats and influence tools they use. In this episode, we will explore how Russia distorts history with its recent adaptation of Russia's history textbook, written for 11th grade students. The revised edition places special emphasis on the decades following World War II, the establishment of a new international order, and the 21st century, and a time frame that also includes the so-called Putin era. In our research, we found significant changes in this edition that indicate this textbook is being used not for historical education, but rather to indoctrinate the next generation and justify the so-called special military operation, which we call a full-scale war. This analysis also delves into the tactics employed by the Russian state apparatus, which combines curricular changes with the suppression of critical thinking to further the textbook's propaganda's goals. Russian propaganda often draws parallel with George Orwell's 1984, reflecting the novel's dystopian elements, such as the manipulation of media, the distortion of language to shape perceptions, and the revision of historical events to align with the evolving narratives, all of which ultimately serve the interests of the ruling government. One illustration of this is the recent adaptation of Russia's history textbook written for 11th grade students. Rewriting history and curtailing dissent in Russian education. Vladimir Medinsky, the current chairman of Russia's Interdepartmental Commission on Historical Education and the country's former Minister of Culture from 2012 to 2020, is notorious for his role in distorting the past and making controversial claims. He has a history of making unfounded claims such as that Russians have an extra chromosome. Due to its limited availability and delayed introduction into schools, as well as the fear of challenging the government's narrative, it is still difficult to understand the widespread acceptance of the 11th grade edition within the Russian society. Medinsky's dismissive response to criticism of this section on the post-Putin era in a recent interview exemplifies his contempt for opposing viewpoints, telling how critics wanted the section burned, to which he replied,
"That is one of the best comments an author of a textbook can receive."
Vulnerabilities in the Russian propaganda apparatus. When comparing textbooks from different time periods, such as those published in 1952 under Stalin and 1980 under Brezhnev, it is clear that there is significant discrepancies in the degree to which they are politicized. This reveals the ferocity and lengths to which the modern propagandists are going to influence the minds of today's youth. The current urgency felt by the Russian state to control the narrative is evidenced by the fact that such massive propaganda measures have never been seen before, even during Russia's historically difficult periods when state control was at its highest. This textbook clearly serves political agendas rather than educational ones. Propagandists from the Kremlin have expanded their strategy to include getting parents of school-aged children interested in the past. Their Telegram channels are full of giveaways and discounts, and the government promised Putin a price drop of 20% from previous editions. These actions reveal the regime's desperation to broaden its grip on society and win over a younger generation, more so than it has previously. Moreover, as these textbooks target students around 16 years old, it is reasonable to assume that their parents belong to a generation that received an education during the Soviet Union era. These parents are especially vulnerable to the textbook's messaging, since they were also subjected to the same kinds of propaganda, indoctrination, and limited possibilities of critical thinking that the text appears to advocate. This tactic of leveraging prior exposure to state-controlled education and media is a consistent theme spanning from the Soviet era to the Putin regime, as highlighted by Russian propagandist Armen Gasparyan. He underscores the significance of these textbooks and their role of shaping students' long-term perceptions, stating,
"What students learn in school shapes how they perceive the world for years to come."
Noteworthy chapters. Upon initial analysis of the new textbook, its intended message becomes readily apparent: power, development, and destruction. The backdrop of the book cover features the Kerch Bridge, a symbol of Putin's pride and notable achievement during his presidency, while a prominent missile which can only represent a Kinjali takes center stage. Several other chapters also captured our attention: US pressure on Russia, countering Western Russian strategies, falsification of history by the West, the return of Crimea, Minsk agreements, and the special military operation. Each of these chapters serve a purpose: to demonize the West and propagate a narrative that harmonizes with the government's objectives. The textbook's emphasis on external factors reveals a vulnerability underlying the Kremlin's intentions. It hinges its legitimacy on grappling with the West, rather than spotlighting Russia's historical achievements. This narrative portrays Russia's triumphs as resistance against an ostensibly united enemy, evoking feelings of pride and nationalism among the Russian population. Navigating historical manipulations. This textbook may serve as a means for the current Russian regime to justify its policies and provide reassurance to the population. This comes in the wake of significant setbacks for the Russian Federation in various aspects, resembling more of a crisis management response than a historical account. What's interesting is the section on the special military operation remains rather brief. It outlines the conflict's beginning, its purpose, so-called defending Donbass, and includes a quote from Putin stating,
"Russia did not start this war, but its operation's goal was to end it."
However, it oversimplifies the war's complexities and consequences. Notably, Putin's wartime address on the morning of February 24, 2022, included the statement,
"This war is a matter of life and death, as well as the historical future of our people."
This sentence employs rhetorical techniques such as emotional appeal, loaded language, binary opposition, hyperbole, and fear tactics to shape the Russian reader's perspective and discourage critical thinking. Suppressed critical thinking. Russian propaganda methodology. Independent thought and critical thinking is stifled by the centralized curriculum in the Russian educational system, which's approach is to have students reciting information over actually analyzing it. Similar to George Orwell's 1984, where
thought crime does not entail death. Thought crime is death.
This echoes the influence of the Russian state propaganda machine. This monopoly on learning has persisted since the Soviet era and continues to affect a sizable fraction of the world's population today, especially in post-Soviet countries, stifling the exploration of alternative perspectives and shutting down candid discussions, not allowing critical thinking to flourish. Therefore, many of the events that are distorted in this history book would go unnoticed by a vulnerable age population that lacks the ability to critically think. Textbook implementation in occupied territories. Armen Gasparyan, author of the Russian history textbooks for the students in the 10th grade and a well-known Russian propagandist, talks about the difficulties of implementing the so-called special military operation part of the curriculum in schools in occupied territories. He elaborates on why this area of the curriculum deserves careful consideration when being taught. According to Gasparin, both students and teachers need to have more time and effort to fully absorb the manipulated narrative due to the unique historical context. Gasparin compares the education system in Crimea with those in other regions of Ukraine, such as Zaporizhia and Kherson. According to him,
with Crimea's strong historical ties to Russia, it took only a week for new teachers to acquaint themselves with the curriculum and teach Russian history there.
However, he acknowledges that regions like Zaporizhia and Kherson present a much more formidable challenge. This finding demonstrates the significance of a methodical and planned strategy in shaping historical memory. The resurgence of military indoctrination. The textbook is but a fragment in Russia's propaganda arsenal. Initial military training, once taught during the Soviet era, faded after the Union's collapse, yet returned to the school curriculum in September 2023. Of course, backed by chief propagandist Solovyev. His anger surfaced on An Evening with Vladimir Solovyev, where he challenged the parents of Russian elites opposing the subject's return, set to replace life safety basics. He said,
"Why don't you like the military training? Do you not realize what time we live in? Girls must be prepared to be midwives, and men, you must perform your civic duty."
With its roots in Soviet-era military indoctrination and its updated textbook, this curriculum strengthens Russia's state propaganda apparatus, and its alignment enables the propagation of a controlled narrative. To summarize, this podcast provides an educational perspective on Russian propaganda strategies, comparing them to Orwellian dystopia, manipulating historical narratives and silencing critical thought. Our research aimed to shed light on how the government is using strategic textbook revisions and the return of military indoctrination to control narratives, shape perceptions, and protect its own interests. The powerful weaponization that this rewriting of history will have on future generations is highlighted by the carefully orchestrated collaboration of state-suppressed education, historical distortion, and indoctrination of children to military training and disposition.